Great. Thanks, Martin. All right, so yeah, I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk to you all about meta-learning. This is a topic that I feel really good about. I'm excited about this. I'm curious to hear what you think, so I'll try to leave enough time for questions at the end. So basically, meta-learning, otherwise known as learning to learn, is an idea and a set of sort of associated methods for learning to do substantial inference from insubstantial amounts of data. All right, so kind of the backdrop here for this story is that we currently have deep learning methods that can attain really impressive performance in terms of predictive accuracy in settings where we have really large amounts of labeled training data. However, if we don't have that much training data, we're somewhat out of luck. So take, for instance, the kind of canonical ImageNet image recognition task, where you give the learning system something on the order of 1,000 examples of each class, and you allow the system to train on each one of those examples many, many times. In that setting, you can achieve really impressively low generalization error when basically asking the system, what's the label of this object that's in some new image that it hasn't seen before. So it's able to generalize these categories that it's learned really effectively once it's seen a ton. If it hasn't seen a lot, you're not really going to be in good shape. So we want methods that will enable us to extend this kind of predictive accuracy, these kinds of wins, in settings where it's prohibitively expensive to collect such a large data set. Right, so in describing to you how meta-learning approaches this issue, I'll take inspiration from an analogy with human learning. This is a particularly appropriate analogy because we can see in human behavior that, for instance, children are excellent at learning from extremely small amounts of data, almost impossibly good at this. So take, for example, language acquisition. When children are learning new words, they're faced with this task of just see a dog or a bus or windshield wipers or a computer just one time, maybe a couple of times. There are so many words that they need to learn that they can't see each one 1,000 times before they start to be able to say, oh, okay, here's a new object. I know that I should apply this word to that object as well. They have to be able to pick this up very rapidly. And they're able to do it, obviously. And so we'd like to try to get some insight from how they accomplish this. Luckily, this ability of humans to basically do concept learning or word learning, or essentially object recognition generalization from only one example is something that's been studied pretty extensively in psychology labs. So we have a pretty reasonable handle on the problem. So in order to demonstrate what I mean by that, let's take a look at this example problem from a paper by Brendan Lake and colleagues from all the way back in 2011. So the task here is to look at the image in the top left, the one with the box around it, and so like humans in the lab would face would be posed with questions like this. Given this image, what other images in this panel belong in the same category? What other objects are of the same kind? And it turns out that people are really good at doing this, which probably as you're looking at it, you're like, okay, yeah, I can see that one over in the middle on the right. It's probably the same. Like, you're pretty good at it. You have a good sense right away. But if you think about this problem, removing all of the kind of knowledge that you're bringing to the table, sort of taking a more a priori tabula rasa kind of view of it, it becomes clear that this is kind of amazing. So there are a really large number of hypotheses that you could make about what the discriminative features are that define this category that's exemplified by the top left image there. So you could say, oh yeah, okay, this is a category consisting of things that are black and gray, so kind of color would be the key. Or you might say, this is a category of things that people ride standing up, or this is a category of things with 2 wheels, or this is a category of things with wheels, or this is a category of things with handlebars, or this is a category of things that have a vertical pipe in the middle, and this could just go on really indefinitely. And yet, the experimenter is asking you to do this inference problem with only a single piece of data. So this is really wildly unconstrained in terms of the generalization problem. And yet, people can do it. So even more remarkably, Lake and colleagues showed that people could do this in the context of these character classes from alphabets from all around the world. So you're basically guaranteed that people haven't seen these categories before. So the question is the same. Given the character drawing on the top left, select the drawings that are in the same character class. And so they showed that people are able to do this really quite effectively. They can achieve high accuracy at this. So this problem is ill-posed. We'd kind of like to know how humans solve it so that we can step back and try to apply the same kind of techniques in our machine learning systems. Fortunately for us, this is a problem that has actually been studied for quite a long time in cognitive psychology. And so as a result, there's very well filled out literature that makes, I think, a fairly compelling case that humans are able to solve these kinds of one-shot generalization problems by making use of background knowledge, or in other words, knowledge of sort of general prevailing statistical structure about the world at large, and they are able to kind of effectively apply this in specific new situations. So to put that another way, people are able to make educated guesses, or yet another way, people are able to make inductive inferences. So this is something we'd really like to be able to do with machine learning systems. So we have a variety of options at our disposal for trying to build this same idea into our systems. And these options fall roughly into two categories. So the first would be the category of building architectural priors. An example of this would be the translation invariance that we get in convolutional networks as a result of the weight sharing across the image. Alternatively, you could try to learn priors. So you could allow some data set to speak for itself by applying some algorithm that soaks in the statistics of that data set in such a way that it can then apply them to do inference in new situations. And really, this is what we're going to be talking about tonight. This is entirely, like meta learning, is all about learning priors that can then be applied in new inference situations. So given that kind of background, we're now in a position to state the problem that we started with, this problem of very sample-efficient learning in a somewhat more precise way. We can now state the problem as, how can we build systems that acquire background knowledge in such a way that they can then apply that background knowledge for inference in new situations? And so this slide kind of summarizes the whole talk. If you just saw one slide, this would be it. Basically, the solution that meta-learning with deep neural networks proposes is to say, look, these are deep learning systems after all, and we're deep learning researchers, so let's just optimize for those capabilities end to end. Right, so at this point, I'll kind of define a lot more precisely what it means to optimize for background knowledge and the ability to apply to new inference situations more precisely. Hopefully you'll have a very clear idea of exactly what that would mean by the end of that section. And then I'll talk about algorithms that are effective in doing this, and we'll look at some results, some of the key results that the field has produced. All right, so in order to explain how meta learning works, I'll actually take a quick step back and just articulate exactly how the usual learning process goes, and then we'll see that meta learning is actually just a couple of essential twists to this usual formula. So this will just kind of help us establish some terminology and notation. So basically, we look at the top there. That's just showing big T is this is kind of the task that you would normally have in a typical learning setting, which would consist of a training set, detrain, and a test set, detest, maybe a validation set, but that's just left out for brevity here. Those data sets would consist of XY pairs, inputs and targets, and you would have some number S of those that would be quite large, hundreds, probably a lot more than that. And your overall goal in this endeavor would be to minimize generalization error, G. So that generalization error, sort of the thing that you want to minimize, is some cost function like negative log likelihood, sum squared error, whatever your favorite is, the value of that cost function over the items in the test set. And the way that you go about trying to accomplish this is by numerically optimizing some objective function, which is that same cost function over the items in the training set. Okay, that should all be, very standard stuff, maybe just stated in a very particular way so that now we can articulate exactly how meta-learning works. Essentially, what we're going to do is say, instead of having a single task that is made up of a training set and test set, we're going to have that little t up there like a bunch of tasks sampled from some task distribution D, where you can think of at this point the task distribution as just a uniform over some set of tasks. It's probably the simplest and most typical case. So yeah, the tasks are still going to be made up of training sets and test sets, and those data sets will be made up of XY pairs. Everything is the same so far. Then we get to the second major twist, which is that now the size of those data sets, S, is going to be very small. It'll be less than 5 examples even, so it could even be 1 example. Right? And now in this setting, the third key difference from the usual learning procedure is that we're actually going to optimize our objective function J that we directly numerically optimize will be a sum over the items in the test set of this cost function. Right, so at that point, you might be saying, wait a minute. You're going to directly optimize for performance on the test set? That sounds like a surefire way to do some overfitting. And indeed, that would be a concern. And as a result, we need to split the set of tasks that we have into a meta-train set and a meta-test set, so that now we have a train-test split over tasks rather than over data points. And so the whole idea here will be that we can train on the testing sets from our meta-train set and then test on the learning problems in our meta-test set in order to make sure that we do have good generalization performance. All right, so just to kind of summarize what we just saw in the last slide, the key idea of meta-learning is to train on learning tasks instead of training on data points, and to test on new learning tasks instead of testing on new data points. So we've kind of just like zoomed out the process by 1 level. All right, so that might seem a little bit mysterious still at this point, so let me go through like a concrete example. I'll use this sort of image recognition, aka concept learning challenge that I've been kind of using as a running example. So in this case, D could be your trading distribution. D could be over image recognition tasks, where essentially you could think of something like taking ImageNet, sampling a set of maybe 4 or 5 classes, sampling a specific example image for each one of those classes, then sampling a test image over all of those classes, and basically giving your training system that very small data set from a subset of the ImageNet classes, and then asking for this new image, which of those classes does it belong to? All right, so in this case, this is an example from a paper from DeepMind from 2015, or 2016 rather, where the sort of the meta training distribution was actually over dog breed categories, and this would be an example task drawn from that distribution. So your D-train would be this set of 4 images, and then you would have this set of labels, one associated with each image. Then you would get a test set, D-test, that would just be some unlabeled image, and the goal of your inference system would be to exclusively from these training examples figure out which class this new example belongs to. And I want to say that crucially, when you go to test this system, you have to test it on classes that it hasn't seen before. You don't just test it on examples you haven't seen before. You actually have to test it on held out categories. All right, so I'm going to now, that's really the meta-learning process. So I'm going to now move on to algorithms. I wanted to take a minute here to ask if there are any questions. Does that all seem clear? Yeah.
So if you're splitting your test data set into meta-train and meta-test,
Yes.
what happens to your training data set?
So you actually split your set of tasks into a meta-train and a meta-test set of tasks. And each task in both of those sort of bins consists of a training set and a testing set. So you've, yeah, cool. Yeah, that's a good question. Yep.
What about the fact that you've got a very, very, very small sample? How do you get convergence on that small sample? You've got the same problem with data volume problems. How do you get sort of refined parameter estimation, even though you're just trying to learn a prior, sort of solve a priori structure into, like you said, like an artificial time learn prior.
Right.
It's still a very, very small data set, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's amazing. It's sort of a pretty bold thing to try to do. But it actually does turn out that if you just have enough of these training tasks, and all those training tasks share some kind of structure that can be learned by a meta-learning system. And that structure then enables inferences from only a very small amount of data, then you're in business. That's really the crux of this whole thing, that those training tasks that you sort of expose your model to share some kind of structure that it can then use to enable inference. So it's kind of like in that example that we were looking at before with the segways and the cars and the motorcycles. It's like you may not have ever seen a Segway before, but that there are scooters and that those differ from bicycles and differ from cars, and you kind of know how the category space is partitioned, and that partitioning is some information that you can then apply when you're expected to do some generalization from some new category example. Yeah, so I mean, we'll see some algorithms for doing this, and maybe that'll make things a little bit more apparent. Yeah.
Do you have any intuition on how this meta learning in itself is different from transfer learning? I mean, they're separate problems, but do you have any intuition on what's the bridge?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's a lot of work on meta learning and transfer learning and continual learning and a number of other topic words like this, and I'm a little bit reluctant to speak for the experts in those various topic areas because people have their definitions that they really like. For me personally, meta learning is one approach to transfer, basically. You kind of just, in the meta learning case, say, I want to be able to transfer my knowledge that I learn on some set of tasks to some other set of tasks, so I'll just train on all the tasks that I have and try to set up the training procedure in such a way that the model isn't able to kind of like overfit to any one of them, with the hope that then I'll kind of like generalize to some other set of tasks. In other words, that I'll transfer that knowledge that I learned to some other set of tasks.
I don't know. I have the feeling that, and tell me if I'm wrong, that the non-trivial bit is now being moved into how you actually select your samples. So actually selecting the distribution might actually become the difficult bit.
The training distribution. Yeah, I think that is a really great point, that you still are in a position where you need to have, if you wanted to apply this in practice, you would need to have a set of training tasks. You'd need to have some training data that that carried the structure that you need for these new learning problems that you have. And I think this isn't something that's just going to magically solve all the problems that that you might have in an applied setting. It's something that will still require some creativity to try to identify a data set that has the structure that you need, that you kind of need to learn into your inference systems, such that you can then apply these in new setting, apply that knowledge in new settings where you have a much smaller data set. Yeah, I would actually be really curious, after the talk, for instance, if anybody has, problems that you think this might be effective for, I'd love to chat about it, because I do think it requires a little bit of creativity. Any other questions? Okay, great. So let's talk about some algorithms. So first of all, we'll talk about model agnostic meta-learning. So this is an approach to meta-learning that, as the name suggests, is agnostic to the choice of essentially architecture. So you could use this with any kind of convolutional net. You could use it with a recurrent network of any description. It should be generic to all of that. And I also chose to describe this one first because it's kind of the thing that you would do if you took the idea of deep learning, how to deep learn, really literally. If you just actually went and did exactly what that would suggest, that would be maml. And it's a very bold idea, and it's kind of amazing that it works. So I am very happy to share it with you. So right, again, in order to describe how this works, I'll just take a step back and kind of articulate how the usual learning process works, this process that we want to optimize. So normally you have some objective function j, which is computed using your model parameters theta. In order to optimize that function, you compute some gradient updates, where the update is the gradient with respect to theta of the objective function. You just apply that to your current parameters in order to get some updated parameters theta prime. All good. Just do that over and over again. Hopefully you get low generalization error. So with maml, what Chelsea Finn and colleagues suggested to do is to literally just take the minimum over all of the parameters theta of the objective function with respect to the parameters theta prime. So in other words, find me the sort of pre-update parameters that make it so that my loss is the best thing that it can be after you've updated the parameters with gradient descent. So of course, again, this being deep learning, the way that minimization is carried out is just by doing gradient descent again. So what this ends up looking like is taking the gradient with respect to the parameters theta of the objective function that's computed using the updated parameters theta prime. Right, so you're actually just taking derivatives of those derivatives. Since that's a differentiable function, that's something you can do. It's not something I would have necessarily thought would work, but it turns out that it works really well. So let's look at some results on that. There were a number of results in that first mammal paper that came out last fall. And I think, for me, the most compelling were results on this omniglot dataset. So this is the one that Brendan Lake and colleagues tested humans on in their lab. So the task is the same here. You see one of these character drawings, and you have to select the other drawings from the same class. Or maybe you see five character drawings, and you have to select among 20 options or something like that. But it's always just a low-shot matching problem. And the impressive thing about mammal isn't just that, I mean, they get really high scores on this task, you know, high 90% range, 90s range on this one-shot learning task. But they also beat a number of pretty strong baselines from prior work. So these are all models that at the time seemed really impressive. So yeah, this is a cool idea that also works really well. In this paper, they also did the same task with mini ImageNet, which is basically a data set that's like ImageNet, but with reduced dimensionality images. And in that case, the accuracy isn't as high, but they are still beating these other very strong competitors. All right, so the next I guess I should say class of algorithms that I'll describe for this are recurrent neural networks. So the idea here is to take your inference problem, whatever it might be, and just turn it into a sequence learning problem. So you can just apply recurrent networks in the normal way that you would do. So the way that might look is shown here in this dog breed classification task. The idea is that you would feed in a single image on each time step along with its associated label. Then on the last time step, the network would be expected to predict the label of some unlabeled test image that's presented on that time step. And it would receive a target. You would do gradient updates from that. And it turns out that this also works pretty well. This was actually one of the relatively early approaches to meta-learning back in 2001. And then in 2016, Adam Santoro and colleagues at DeepMind basically used the same formula with so-called memory augmented neural networks, basically recurrent networks with some external memory, in order to get pretty impressive performance, again, on this omniglot data set. It was a slightly different setup from what we saw before, but kind of the takeaway is the same, that they're able to generalize from these characters, from a single one of these characters to other characters of the same class. Right, so just to drive that point home, you can really do this with LSTMs or DNC or some other recurrent network. Is pretty agnostic to that. All right, and then the last algorithm that I'll talk about, mostly just because I like it. There are a lot of other algorithms for this. I'll have a quick list of them at the end. The last one that I'll talk about is matching networks. It's an algorithm that's kind of based on a k-nearest neighbor sort of approach. I like this one because it kind of, it's one of the most sensible things that you could do in this situation. I think it kind of really clearly demonstrates what the problem is. So here you embed the query image using some function, f theta. It's probably a convnet. It is a convnet in their paper, but you could use something else if you wanted to. That will be your query embedding. Then you embed all of the elements in your labeled training set. Then you use some distance metric like cosine distance, for example, to compute the distance between the query embedding and the labeled set embeddings, which gives you a set of distances, which you then pass through softmax, and you sample from that softmax to get your chosen label, the guess that your system makes about the label that should be applied to the test image. And they also get respectable performance on omniglot. Another thing that was pretty nifty that they did in this paper, this was by Oriol Vinyals and colleagues at DeepMind, by the way. So another thing that they did in this paper was apply this method to the full-scale sort of ImageNet data set. So in this case, they're sampling classes from the entire, from a subset of the full set of ImageNet categories and testing on some held-out set. And in that setting, they're able to get over 93% accuracy on ImageNet, which is kind of impressive. I mean, these are the full-size ImageNet images, and they're still getting over 90% of these one-shot, five-way problems accuracy. So there are a number of other algorithms for this. I'll just kind of list them here. I mean, there's a huge amount of work on this right now, and a lot of it's very interesting. Also, there was a lot of prior work that went under the heading of one-shot learning that had the same flavor, also was good for these kinds of problems, but it didn't have this idea of meta-learning. All right, so with that, I'll move on from these classification and regression problems that we've been looking at so far, from these cases where you have a very strong supervision signal, to basically ask, can you apply this meta-learning idea in scenarios where you want to learn from sparse and stochastic rewards, where you want to learn inductive biases for exploring, where you want to learn inductive biases for planning efficiently. Essentially, if you want to learn to reinforcement learn. It turns out that, in fact, there is some work on this, and it seems very much to be possible. So the resulting sort of idea of combining meta-learning and reinforcement learning is meta-RL, which is essentially just a couple of tweaks from the formula we saw before. We still are going to be sampling tasks T from some task distribution D, but now T is going to be a Markov decision process, just defined in the usual way. And the other key difference is that the objective function, rather than being some squared error or negative log likelihood or something like that, it's going to be the expectation over the test MDPs, sorry, the expectation over the task and the task distribution of the sum of rewards, essentially. All right, so you might guess, based on the large degree of similarity between the meta-learning setup and the meta-RL setup, that we might be able to apply some of the same algorithms, and indeed we can. I'll talk first. Well, actually, I'm only going to talk about the application of recurrent networks to this. maml also can be applied, but I don't think I'll have time for that. All right, so there were actually two papers that came out about 2 years ago now, almost exactly at the same time, that investigated the possibility of doing meta-reinforcement learning with LSTMs. So the idea there is, in contrast to the last sort of meta-learning with recurrent network diagram that we saw, is to input to the network X, which is some observation from the environment, which will be passed through like a convnet, probably, some kind of encoder that will then project into an LSTM, which outputs a policy, so just a set of logits over the possible actions, which can then be passed through a softmax and sampled from in order to behave. And the LSTM will also output a value function just for training purposes. These were trained with actor critic, an actor critic loss function. The other thing that's passed into the LSTM in this case that's really essential is the reward from the previous time step. Also, the action from the previous time step is passed in. It seems to help a little bit. But the reward is kind of the really conceptually essential input to this LSTM, because that reward signal enables the LSTM to learn from its previous actions without having to wait for gradient updates to provide a reward signal. What this enables, effectively, is reinforcement learning algorithms to be learned in the dynamics of the LSTM. Essentially, the system can do something, immediately on the next time step, see the results of that, and then effectively plan some further action based on those results. So let's take a look at an example setting in which we can see the benefits of something like that. So this is a navigation task from a paper by Piotr Murawski in 2016. The task distribution here is over MDPs that have the transition structure. They all share the same transition structure that's depicted on the right there, and the observations are of the character of that on the left. So it's a 3D navigation problem with a environment shaped like the image on the right. And each one of these MDPs differs in the goal location. So when the agent enters a new environment, it should efficiently explore this maze, ideally by doing something like exploring each arm of the maze in succession. And after it finds the goal, it respawns in the same maze, has some fixed number of time steps in each maze, and it should then immediately navigate back to the goal that it's observed. Right. So, indeed, we do see that this LSTM meta-learning agent is able to essentially meta-learn to do those two things. So the green dots show the location, the starting location for the agent, and the yellow-green small dots show the trajectory the first time the agent navigates through the maze. So you can see a really clear exploration trajectory there. You can also see that it's not actually going all the way down the arm. So once it's able to look around the corner, it seems to know that it doesn't have to actually go down that hallway because it doesn't actually see the cone thing or whatever that is. So it's not going to get reward. It knows that it can go look for reward somewhere else. So this is an example of the kind of thing that the system has meta-learned such that it can explore more efficiently. Then the blue dots show the agent's trajectory when it respawns after finding the goal. So in that case, we see that it navigates directly to the goal. So it's also kind of learned to remember, to kind of recall from its working memory the location of the goal that it discovered with its intelligent exploration policy. And it's then able to use that information to inform a policy that navigates right to the goal. So it's essentially meta-learned to do that as well. Just wanted to point out that Dwan and colleagues at OpenAI in Berkeley actually did almost exactly the same experiment. This one was in VizDoom, the other one was in Labyrinth. It was cool to see convergent evidence on that. Okay, so the navigation task kind of showcased some of the things that you can meta-learn. Another setting that really exemplifies the things that can be meta-reinforcement learned is this sequential bandit setting. So if you're not familiar with how the setting goes, the idea is the agent is provided with some set of options or some set of actions that it can take, kind of like bandit arms. Each one of these actions has some latent reward probability, which the agent can discover only by pulling the arms, one action per time step, and observing a sample reward from that distribution. The agent gets a certain number of pulls on a given reward distribution. Is that 10? 15, okay. Oh, 15 minutes left. Okay, great. Oh, well, it's good to go. Yeah, so where was I? Oh, yeah, so the agent will get some fixed number of pulls at a set of bandit arms before the episode ends, and the objective is that the agent should efficiently explore the arms and then exploit the best one. It's got a trade-off between exploration and exploitation. So just to be really clear about what's going on in this task as far as the agent architecture is concerned, now we have that same LSTM setup that we had before. Now there's no observation. The LSTM just receives the reward from the previous time step and the action from the previous time step on each time step, and outputs a policy over the arms and a value function for training. Okay, so let's dive into the results here. This is the LSTM compared with some kind of standard canonical bandit algorithms from the literature. Here we're looking at, on the x-axis, the trial number. So 0 is the very first pull, 100 is the very last pull. And then on the y-axis, we're looking at cumulative regret. So regret is the difference between the expected reward of the most highly rewarding arm and the expected reward of the arm that the agent actually pulled. So lower is better here. What you want to see is that the agent is not getting very much regret. What we see is that Thompson and UCB, which are kind of well-respected pretty hard bandit baselines are outperformed by the LSTM. However, Gittins indices, which in this particular case is optimal, is outperforming the LSTM. So this is, I should have said before, this is a bandit problem where the reward probabilities are independent of one another. So if you observe a reward from a given arm, you can't make any inference about what the reward probabilities of the other arms are. So in that particular limited case, we have a computationally tractable way to compute the optimal policy. And in that particular case, the LSTM is slightly worse. So I mean, it's doing reasonably well. I think the really interesting thing happens when you move to a scenario where the arms are correlated. So in this scenario, you actually can make some inference about the reward probabilities of the arms you didn't pull from the rewards that you saw, from the reward that you saw from the arm that you did pull. In this setting, it's really computationally intractable to try to compute the optimal solution. We don't have a nice analytical method for this. So it's not plotted here because you really can't do it very easily. And in this case, what we see is that the LSTM not only bridges the gap to Gittins, it actually outperforms Gittins, which suggests that in these kinds of settings where we don't have a way to calculate the optimal policy, we can do better than what we could do with kind of standard out-of-the-box techniques. We can derive numerically an algorithm that is more appropriate for the sort of the specifics of the, for instance, bandit distribution in this case, the problem at hand, if we just have a way to generate a lot of tasks of that kind. So essentially, meta-learning is able to soak up these details of the task distribution, like the character of the correlation among the arms, in order to outperform the methods that we would otherwise be limited to. So that's kind of exciting. So I am now going to wrap up by going over the learned biases that we kind of observed in these examples that I gave. So, the whole idea here with meta-learning is to try to imbue our agents with appropriate inductive biases that are kind of gleaned from the data itself. So in the navigation case, we saw that the agent was able to learn to do this like sort of sequential arm exploration. It seems to have learned kind of a stationarity assumption about the environment. If you were using like epsilon greedy exploration, for instance, you wouldn't get that. You would get an agent that would be kind of jittering around, exploring the same state multiple times. You can avoid all of that by just meta-learning and exploration policy here. Another interesting case was this looking down the hallway behavior. It knows that the reward occurs when it sees that cone thing, so it knows that if it can't see the cone thing down that hallway, then it doesn't need to go down there. So those are two examples of inductive biases that have been learned. In the bandits case, some inductive biases that we can kind of infer from the agent's behavior. First is that the agent has learned to infer rewards that are reward probabilities associated with other arms. That's apparently how it's beating Gittins indices. Another thing that is apparently learned is kind of a fixed rewards assumption. So the algorithm would be unlikely to do as well as it does if it were entertaining hypotheses involving changing reward probabilities, which is not something you would get from like a tabula rasa agent. Now in the object recognition case that we started out with first, the biases are a little bit harder to identify. In these really simple navigation problems and these bandit problems, we can kind of just look at the agent behavior and sort of infer what the agent is doing, what it's meta-learned such that it can carry out these smart behaviors. Whereas in the object recognition case, it's not as easy to do. And this is kind of a reflection of the general difficulty of interpreting ConvNets and deep networks in general. So we see that the network is, for instance, the matching network is good at inferring what other objects belong in the same category as some example from some other example from ImageNet. We don't really know exactly which features it was using. Was it using something about the color or the shape or some complex combination of those? And this actually is sort of an open research question. We see that the agent is doing really, or the learning system in this case, is doing really well in terms of accuracy, and I think it would be pretty cool to know more about how it's doing it. So we had a paper about this at ICML last year that investigated the possibility that an inductive bias that is really popular in the psychology literature that was studied decades ago and has kind of been replicated many times also appears to be used by the batching networks. Right, so this is basically a bias for, in the face of ambiguity, assuming that shape is more likely to be the discriminative, like definitive feature of a new category than color is. So it was kind of nice to see that we could at least show that these systems have at least one inductive bias that is, first of all, articulable. We can understand what it is. And second, is one that humans also exhibit. So it seems to be doing something pretty sensible. If we were to specify how we wanted our learning system to behave in the presence of ambiguity, like when, for instance, deploying it in some new situation on new data, that would be a heuristic that I think we would be reasonably happy with. All right, so how much time do we have left?
Just that question.
Okay, great. Wow, that's where it's at. Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, although.
Thank you for your talk.
Sure.
So I have a basic question.
Yeah.
So the meta-learners seem to compare themselves to other meta-learners. But
Yeah.
I want to know how good is your meta-learn in a specific task against a non-meta learner that has been optimized for that task? How close do you come to the best performance at the moment?
So when you say a non-meta learner that has not been optimized, like what would be an example?
Well, against a so a meta RL against a true classic RL agent, or
I see.
when you do object recognition
Right.
against a network
I see.
optimized for object
Yes.
recognition. So we're
Right.
actually performing the same task as the
Yeah.
specialized ones.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So let's go back to I think this is a good. No, this is the one that I want. So in this ImageNet classification case, you could imagine taking a ResNet or an Inception network, some big ConvNet that would achieve really high scores on ImageNet, and just not train it on ImageNet and just train it on like those 5 images, and then test it on 5 other images and try to get it to output the right labels. And that would just straight up not work at all. I mean, you would just overfit really, really severely, or you would just not learn anything. Another thing that you could do that maybe wouldn't qualify as exactly meta learning, that actually would do really well, would be to take a network, like for instance Inception, this is just the name of like some really big ConvNet, train it on the usual ImageNet task, like the usual 1,000 category, have as much data as you want task, and then you could take the penultimate layer from that network, the second to last layer, the one right before the softmax, and you could just basically embed your images here using just that function, and then use the cosine distance to calculate the distance among them, and just always guess the thing that has the closest cosine distance to your test label. And it turns out that that actually does really quite well. So that's at 87.6 there. So that's kind of amazing. Like you can just take Inception, train it in the usual way, and then just do this trick where you embed all the images and select the label associated with the image in the test set that is closest under cosine distance in that embedding, and get really great accuracy. I think that there's a lot to be made of that, and we kind of talk about that in that last paper that I mentioned. I will say that the matching networks do get better performance, but when you think like, oh, I could get almost 88% without it, it puts things into a somewhat different perspective. Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
We're running really late, so maybe just one more question.
Yeah.
Again, excellent talk. Maybe a naive and a little bit greedy problem, greedy question. So, is there any a concrete example for meta-learning which is not RL, for example? So, is any more classic machine learning algorithm where we apply or use meta-learning scheme to have a reasonable prior. So is there any kind of simple example for people to grasp what meta-learning is?
Right. So there are the image processing settings that we saw in the example. You could also use this in natural language settings, for instance, if you wanted to do something like domain adaptation. If you had a sufficient number of domains, then you could do something like train, let's say we're trying to do language modeling, and we want to have a network that we can throw into some new type of domain, some different kind of, let's say, different genre of news than it's been trained on before, and have it very rapidly kind of learn the idiosyncrasies of that genre. If we had available a sufficient number of other genres, we could just do this process out of the box that we saw with these image recognition systems, but just with, let's say a sequence to sequence, or I should say just a recurrent neural network language model. Maybe we could get something reasonable like that.
Great,
All right.
thank you.
Thanks, everyone.